I have to, I guess, find a place where I feel authentic.
Yeah.
If I begin to feel authentic as the character, it's because I've found out all the shit that I need to know about their life, their world, their family, their relationships, their education, their, there's all those sort of obvious things on the outside. But then people have secrets and desires and things that aren't obvious. I don't know. And then there'll be just one thing that one day you'll go, okay, yeah, that clicks. Something a way in, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to dig in. I wanted to ask, start by asking you a little bit about God's Creatures. I know many of you haven't seen it yet, but, I was really interested. It's a naughty, fascinating film. And I was wondering, you've had such a storied career, which we're going to go through today. But at this point in your career, what makes you choose a project like this?
It was an absolutely beautiful script. It's one of those things that lands and you just go, who are these people making this film? How did they do this? And how do they know so much about that? And it immediately, because it's a little bit of the history of how it came about. Forgive me if I'm speaking for people who are here, but the story, it's written by Shane Crowley, but it came about from a story for Fola, who's the producer, and they both of them come from this part of the world where this fishing community, this oyster community exists, and it just had such a smell of authenticity, but also it has a real sense of the powerful history of Irish theatre, really, and that tradition of the ties that bind, and families who never really properly talk about anything, and these awful events happen, and everybody's just and it was just felt like a very powerful examination of what is a very, very hot issue now. It's about a sexual assault, but it's done in a way, examines why is it that we don't talk about it? Why is it that it's not? Why does a community close ranks around someone who's committed a sexual assault? How is that structure come about? And the filmmakers, Celia and Anna, are brilliant at are quietly asking that question. It's like they're dropping little bombs really through the movie.
Right now, do you think is it script first? Is it directors first in terms of picking your projects?
It completely depends.
Okay.
To be honest as well, I've got 2 teenage children, so it's a lot of my things have to be practical as well.
Yeah.
So can I do that? I'm not sure. But with this movie, and when it was first offered to me, I envisaged myself popping back from Dublin or wherever we were going to be every weekend. No. We were there for 9 weeks. And we all had to isolate in our little cottages along the coast. And it was actually a very, very powerful induction into the world of the movie, because we just became really one with the place. It was lovely.
I love that. I want to go back to the beginning. Obviously, this is a career retrospective, but let's go back way to the beginning. When did you sort of first get the desire to be an actor, a performer?
I think when I was at school, I wasn't one of the cool kids who were good at acting. I secretly probably wanted to be, but I was much more, I wanted to write. I wanted to be a writer. I read a lot of books when I was a kid. I had a very strange upbringing. We didn't have a television. There was a whole kind of religious thing going on. But that was my escape, was reading books. And I think that's something that made me an actor. I didn't know it at the time, but I think if you can, or just a storyteller really, if you can form a really beautiful, elegant, brilliantly put together sentence, you can tell, you can act, you can tell a story, you can make a movie, it's that sort of, it's the building block of storytelling, and you get that from reading.
Does reading and writing sort of still figure into your process when you're tackling a role, or?
Yes. I mean, obviously, when you play things that have source material, real people, and there's all that kind of reading that you need to do, often though I find it'll be the tiny little snippet of, there's a minute of film that exists of somebody, or the sound of. For me, the sound of the voice is like my starting place.
Oh,
I think because my own voice is very heady and slightly ugly, nasally.
I don't think that's true.
It sort of immediately delineates my class and where I come from, and it's very. I don't know, it's a very English thing, and the way that my sentences dip down at the end and all that kind of thing, it just places me. Yeah. So I that's my first, just to get away from me. That's the sound of my voices.
Well, I do want to get into dialect a little bit later because you've done such amazing dialect work. But I wanted to ask sort of what was the moment when, how did you sort of start the process of actually becoming an actor? What was your process of?
I did an English degree at Bristol University in England. And while I was there, I did a lot of plays, student drama, terrible plays. I mean, awful. But I just got the bug for the smell of the grease paint, and I loved being around it, and it felt like a world that was really alive.
Yeah.
And then I was lucky enough to actually make it happen.
Yeah. You did a lot of theater before ever starting in film. I believe Breaking the Waves, your film debut, was when you were 29.
Yes.
Did you think that you were going to sort of stay in theater for most of your career?
Yes. I mean, when I became an actor in London, it was, theatre was the high holy art.
Yeah.
And that's what you aimed for. And then everybody would sort of lower themselves to do a bit of telly, to make some money.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a pathway to film at all, or there was, but it was incredibly rare. And but I sort of strangely had moments where, when I was quite young, I just left college. I was really good friends with Mark Ravenhill. Do you know the playwright?
Yeah.
Shopping and Fucking. We shared a house, and with some other friends, and we had a day where we did one of those books where actualization, you have to. And this was long before he became Mark Ravenhill, and I said, I think I'd like to. You had to say what you wanted to do, and it would happen. I said, I'd like to get a job at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and he said, I'd like to have a play on in the West End. And about 6 months later, both things happened. So I think there's sometimes you just, you kind of connect with, I don't know, something. But I remember walking along to the National, I was doing a play at the National, and just thinking, I think I'd like to do a film. And it just being, when it came along, it was, I'd never auditioned for a film before. I didn't know anything really about film. It was a very, very unusual experience to do that. And it was like somebody opening a door and go, come this way. Okay.
Well, it's not like, you're also not just making a film, you're making a film with Lars von Trier. It's probably unusual.
I didn't know any of that. I didn't know about film. I didn't know who he was. I remember a while later working with Bobby Carlyle and he'd been making a TV series up on the coast of Scotland up there. And he said, yeah, we were all thinking there's making some Danish porn movie up and nobody had heard of Lars.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
generally, except in a very rarefied circles.
What was the process of auditioning like, knowing, going from, having never really done film before?
I was sent some lines to learn, I think. And I did a terrible Scottish accent, I seem to remember. But I think and I still have this to this day, that being an actor is really, nobody tells you, if you do your best work when you get to the point where you really make an idiot of yourself. And you go to a point where you go, oh shit, I wish I hadn't done that. Because I really put my neck on the line. I really exposed myself, and I'm just going to get humiliated and laughed at.
Yeah.
And sometimes you are humiliated and laughed at. And sometimes it's really amazing. But you have to, people sort of look at it with hindsight and go, oh, it's incredibly skillful or it's incredibly brave. A lot of the time it's just stupid. I think. I'm sure there's actors here who understand what I mean. It's just like you have to lose the editor that keeps you safe.
Yeah. I mean, what was that sort of experience of losing that editor like on a film like Breaking the Waves, which is so provocative, which does go to such extreme places?
Because I didn't have anything to compare it with, it was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
It was very emotional. I think at the end, when we finished the film and they said cut for the last time, I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed because I didn't know how to. It was that moment of, oh my God, I've made such an idiot of myself. I've really, but I had incredibly good role models all around me. I had Stellan and Katrin Cartledge, who sadly passed away a long time ago now, 2001. But they were both what I would call really proper actors who cared passionately about the things that matter and not about the things that don't. And that's such good. I was so lucky to have them to show me that that's the way to do it and not the other way.
Yeah. You mentioned doing what you called, and I'm sure it wasn't, but a terrible Scottish accent for your audition. And we talked about, you mentioned sort of finding a voice in dialect. And I was wondering sort of broadly, like how you approach dialect. You've done so many over the course of your career.
I always, if I can, I think always have a dialect coach.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe that I can't do it instinctively and easily. And when I can to a certain extent, but I can't make it accurate unless I study.
Yeah.
And a lot of dialects are, they'll all, whatever you're doing is very, very specific.
Yeah.
And if you get the specifics right, then you find the character.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about like Irish. What are the nuances? I'm just interested. What are the nuances of something like God's Creatures versus The Boxer versus Angela's Axes?
The Boxer's Northern Ireland.
Okay.
This God's Creatures was absolutely terrifying. I think as you get older, you get more and more aware of how much you're encroaching into other people's worlds, and but I was, there was Paul Mescal and all these amazing Irish actors, and we had to do a read-through on Zoom, all in our little cottages, and just wanting to die because it was just, and I had to speak in Irish as well, and I'd been studying that, and like Paul's a fluent Irish speaker. It was absolutely toe-curlingly excruciating. But that's the thing, that's the bit you have to get over.
Yeah.
And I'd actually found out, because I met Fowler's family, I heard recordings of Fowler's family, that in Kerry, where she comes from, nobody sounds the same anyway. They all sound utterly different. Different members of her family sound like they're from different parts of the world.
Yeah.
But I did, when I was offered the film, I went online and went to sort of YouTube, Donegal, Kerry accent, couldn't understand a single word they were saying. Terrifying.
What does voice sort of mean? Like, you mentioned how important sort of voice is for your performance. Why is voice so important for your performance? Why is that sort of where you start?
I think your voice instantly betrays exactly who you are.
Yeah.
The sound of your voice gives so much, not just about your education and where you've been brought up and all of those things, but about whether you're a kind person or a hard person or a proud person or a humble person or there's so much in the actual sound.
Yeah.
So that's something I like to just really work with, and then when I feel I'm getting that, and occasionally it's a really quick thing.
Yeah.
When I did GOSFORD Park, I was shooting something else beforehand, and I remember I was flying from LA to go and shoot it in London, and I had hardly any prep time. I remember sitting with my husband in the kitchen, and I said, okay, I'm going to read the ingredients on the back of this brown packet of bran flakes, and that's what it's going to be. And I did. I read it out, and that was right. Okay, decided. Okay, done.
And it was just something that came to you with the...
No, well, then that was more because it's a very familiar, that's like a kind of Cockney London.
Okay. I love that. I wanted to ask, sort of, after Breaking the Waves, you were met with so much acclaim. I mean, it was your entry in the film world, and it was unbelievable. And how did you go about from there sort of deciding what you wanted to do in this space?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think because of my experience of the way I kind of grew up in a very, it was a little bit like life imitating art, quite a repressive religious situation. And then when I made the film, it was a real kind of two fingers up to that. Yeah. And I'm forging this very independent path. And my sort of sense of myself was that I have to maintain my integrity. That was like my way of, because I was being wined and dined and courted, and in a way that was utterly bewildering. Where you'd come from, where I'd come from, it was like, what the, really? I mean, I remember sitting with my agent in the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills, and she just had she had a piece of paper with a list of things that I'd been offered, and we just sat there giggling like, this is ridiculous. But a lot of it was very sort of come hithery, lots of money, spandex. Yeah. Well, not quite spandex, not that. But so I had an instinct not to go in that direction, I guess.
Yeah, what was that instinct? Why didn't you want to do that? Because was The Boxer your first film after?
No.
There was something in between.
I did a film called Metroland with Christian Bale. I think because of my theatre background as well. I was a bit of a sort of, possibly a bit of a snob. And didn't want to do crap,
I was wondering, I actually did want to go back. I want to move forward, but I did want to go back a little bit and ask, you mentioned sort of the life imitating art piece of Breaking the Waves, and I was rewatching it, and those scenes where you're talking to yourself as God and then as Bess, can you talk a little bit about sort of exploring these religious themes in this film, sort of given where you come from, given your upbringing, and what that was like sort of putting that into that film?
Those scenes very specifically, I worked with Lars on exactly how that should be and how it should sound. And he said to me, it's like a little girl talking to her dolls. But I think there was, I don't think I had to work on it. I just had an innate sense of, what it was to have faith and be, I can't really describe it, but it was all very confusing for me, I have to say, at the time.
Yeah.
And I then sort of came out of it and went to the Cannes Film Festival and tried to come over as a very sophisticated and didn't really know what I was doing.
Yeah. When do you think you sort of gained that, feeling of not being confused anymore, of sort of,
I don't think I have.
There wasn't one role that sort of, where you sort of felt like you had a new sense of confidence sort of walking into the film?
I think it took a while to kind of feel settled in it all, but also it's such a roller coaster of a thing, because you're going to different places and doing different things, and I don't know really. It's not a question I find easy to answer.
I was curious. I wanted to ask a little bit about, you mentioned sort of, in this, when we were talking about voice, sort of playing real people, and,
Yes.
Hilary and Jackie was one, and the reaction to that film was very controversial, especially over the portrayal of Jackie. And I was wondering, generally, what is the responsibility you sort of feel going into when you're portraying a real person, and how do you tackle that?
I think that's a really good question. It's like, if you get very close to the sense of them, then you can get to the point where you go, I can't do it. I can't do anything, because it's all too personal and it's too. But I do think the sort of culture around all that stuff has changed a lot since I made that film.
Yeah.
And I'm so much older, and I kind of look at it now and go, wow, if I got that script now, would I do it? I don't know.
How so? Just
because
in terms of
just because of the, this is quite a big thing to say in public, but I feel the intrusion into Daniel Barenboim's life and things like that. I just kind of look at it now and go, wow, okay. But I just wanted to do it because it was such a great part, and it was such a great story, and I got to play the cello, and it was an amazing thing to be a part of.
And did you learn to play the cello for that part?
I had played cello as a child I got grade 2, like squeaky. So yes, I mean, that was a great experience in itself.
Yeah.
I had a rehearsal room weirdly, I don't know why they got me a rehearsal room, but in a place where actual real musicians rehearse, by the Wigmore Hall, which is like where people make their, they come from Moscow and make their debut in London. Anyway, so there's these rehearsal rooms, and I had this bow was soaked, and I learned the fingering and the bowing, and then occasionally I would play it without that, see how it. And occasionally there was a little glass window, and people would look in and go, what is going on there? Yeah, but I remember saying to my husband, how on earth am I going to manage this? He said, fear of universal scorn. I talked to Sarah Lancashire recently. Did you know she did that? Julia.
Yes.
And we discussed that it's a very powerful force, the fear of universal scorn, where you take on something that is beloved and known. And
how important is it for you when you're doing something like Hilary and Jackie and obviously you weren't fully playing the way that Jacqueline du Pré played, but, to learn as close as you can a skill in that way? I think you have to do it to the best of your ability, and that was as much about having time. Yeah, and I had time. I had really good teachers, and I had a movement coach, and had a lot of help. Yeah. Do you feel different ways about different sort of, going back to the idea of playing real people? Obviously that was Hilary and Jackie is a very specific case, but do you feel a different way about, say, Angela McCourt and Angela's Ashes? Do you feel differently about sort of approaching, depending on the material?
Yes. I think as well that Angela's Ashes was already a fully formed, much beloved, beautiful thing. Yeah. Written by Frank McCourt, and he was totally part of what we were doing, and we had his blessing, and that film really was very much driven by children. It was,
right.
And that's what it was about. And there were 27 children on that film. It was quite challenging. But that's, it didn't have that same controversial. I think there were a few people in Limerick who were a bit upset.
But is there another form of pressure too when you're sort of tackling that book was so beloved at the time?
Yes,
What is that, and what is that like? How do you sort of think about, or can you even think about that going in?
Well, you have to a certain extent, I guess, but after a while you just got to go, I've got to jump in and do this and not worry too much. You have to worry a bit, obviously. But, yeah.
How do you think about, you've worked with so many incredible directors. From Lars von Trier, you mentioned, to Robert Altman, to Paul Thomas Anderson. At a certain point in your career, did you start sort of seeking out directors, or what, I guess what also was the pleasure of sort of working with all these different...
I tell you that particular sequence, Robert Altman, Paul Thomas Anderson, was very special because around that time they became friends.
Oh, wow.
And I went from shooting Punch Drunk Love, where Paul was doing, we were doing so many takes and he was so involved in every tiny little morsel of everything.
Yeah.
He's the only director who's ever picked me up at the airport himself. I love him. He's just the most beautiful man, but he is in control of everything.
Yeah.
And he was obviously having a really kind of quite a confounding adventure of his own. Yeah. And so you just had to kind of turn up, but we would do a lot of takes, and it was very, very, everything was very meticulous and careful. And then I came to London and went straight to GOSFORD PARK. And I remember going to the set and watching a rehearsal in the drawing room, and it was Maggie Smith and Kristen Thomas and all the posh people, the upstairs people, and they were rehearsing, and I just remember I stood by the monitor going, oh my God, he's completely lost it. It's chaos, and this is going to be a disaster. And then he said, okay, I think I'm ready to go for a take. and it was genius. It was absolutely genius. It was this beautifully architecturally orchestrated chaos.
Oh, wow.
And then I shot my first scene, and it was the very end of the movie when I come out of the house carrying a dog, and there's I had a wig and a dog and an accent, which is not a good way to start. And we did 2 takes, one in sunshine and one in cloud. And he said, okay, I think we got it.
Wow.
So you are kidding me. He said, no, that's it, I've got it. He said, I'm not interested in what you do when you've worked out what you're doing.
That's so funny.
It was like he would pile all the actors up behind the door, let the door open, and everybody fell in, and he just, and you quite often didn't know whether you were on camera or not because there were 2 cameras. So they were those 2 experiences were so different, and yet they had, when we were doing press for Punch Drunk, Paul and I would call him, and because they were getting really close. And then when he shot Prairie Home Companion, which was his last film, he always had to have a standby director because he'd had a heart transplant 10 years before, I think. When we did GOSFORD Park, it was Stephen Frears. And when he shot Prairie Home Companion, it was Paul, and Paul just went and sat on set next to him, and they helped him make the movie, which was a really beautiful. It's a movie about a man who's dying.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I want to ask a little bit more about those 2 movies because they are favorites, and I just dropped the questions, but we'll get those later. Thank you. Thank you. Punch Drunk is such an incredible movie. And so, you mentioned sort of this confounding experience that Paul was having. And it is sort of a beautifully confounding movie. That's a wonderful way to put it. And what was it like sort of stepping into that world that has this sort of, it has a dreamlike quality to it. You're working with Adam Sandler, who's giving this fascinating performance. I just want to know sort of what it was like.
Well, I had a lot of catching up to do. I didn't, because I was sort of relatively new to everything. I was aware of Adam, but I didn't really know his work. And then I sat down and watched a lot of his films and went, and I think there was probably a moment when he was sitting in Beverly Hills watching Breaking the Waves, having a similar response. But it was joyous. It was absolutely joyous. And Paul said to me, I don't want you to do any of your stuff, your thing, whatever you prepare yourself, whatever you do. I don't want you to do any of it.
Yeah.
I just want you to turn up.
Okay.
And be present, which is terrifying.
Yeah, and how does that work when you're doing so many takes too, and you're sort of figuring it out?
I think you have to reach a point of relaxation where you just kind of trust that he thinks what you're doing is all right.
Okay.
But that was touch and go, and it wasn't always there. He used to come up to me and say, the only direction he'd come up to me is he'd say, these are not the droids you're looking for. I'd go, okay, great. But we just had the best time.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so much fun making that film. And then there was a bit when we went to Hawaii and we only shot at dawn and dusk.
I mean, the colors in those sequences are incredible, and you can really feel that. I mean, it sort of brings it to me because that's such an interesting choice on his part, but it's such a romantic movie. And I was wondering what the feeling is of, in all of its weird strangeness, what is the feeling of sort of portraying those sweeping?
Because my daughter's just started doing A-level film studies, and we had to watch a whole load of movies with her over the summer. We sat down and watched La La Land again. And it just really reminded me of that moment, because Paul talked about Punch Drunk as if it was a musical where nobody actually bursts into song, but it's almost as if, so he wanted all the colours to look like all those, when we watched a lot of musicals, it felt like it was about to be that, but it never quite did. Yeah.
I love that. And what was your having sort of then done the whole Adam Sandler filmography, what was the experience of then getting on set with him?
That he is the most amazing, generous, hardworking, turns up every day, really wonderful to work with. Yeah. And very, very funny. I mean, there are moments in the film where I am sitting on my hands, pinching myself, laughing, and you can see, because he just would start off and Paul would let him go. And I
love that. Moving on to Gosford, what, you mentioned sort of watching, all the posh people do a scene. What was it like walking onto the set with that cast? It is just one of the most amazing casts that ever has been assembled.
He said that you have that many actors on set, they'll police themselves. And it was true. I mean, it was so intimidating that actually you just kind of went, it's like being in a dream and everybody's there. And I'm just going to, you just got to get on with it. But there was a day, there's a scene in that movie where there's a huge dinner table scene, and at the very end of it's a long Steadicam shot. Not he didn't do Steadicam, but it's a very it's a long tracking shot going backwards and forwards, and there's a long conversation happens, and it's all in one take. And at the very end of it, I interject into the conversation in a way that's really shocking, but it wasn't really very in the script. It wasn't very motivated. It was a really difficult thing to work out how to do it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we did one take, and I had literally Maggie Smith, Alan Bates, Kristen Scott Thomas, Derek Jacobi. It went round the room. Richard E. Grant over my left shoulder, sniggering. I love Richard. Oh, that's not. Absolutely terrifying. And I was sort of saying, I was asking Maggie Smith, what do you think I should do? How to, she said, what do I try like this? She was really, really nice to me. And we did 2 takes, and I felt awful about it. And the thing about these takes both is that everybody was eating a quail with a chicken inside a quail inside a, it was one of those things where it's like 6 birds all stuffed into each other. And so it was about a half-hour reset every time we did another take. So we did 2 takes, and I felt terrible. And I said to him, please, can we do another one? And he said, okay, reset. And we did another one, and that's in the movie.
Oh my goodness.
And I said to him afterwards, I thought, you're Robert Altman, you know what you're doing. He said, you're Emily Watson, you know what you're doing.
I mean, that's so amazing. I mean, you mentioned sort of his desire for those quick takes. What else is he like sort of working? What else was it like working with him as a director, sort of knowing that he had this storied career coming in and watching him deal with all these people?
Absolutely fascinating. I mean, he would turn up on a Monday morning, barely able to move. And the first couple of weeks we were just like, is he really ill? What's happening? Is he dying? What's going on? And the producer said, no, it's just because he smoked so much weed over the weekend. And by Wednesday he'll be fine. And it was true. And he used to say, if there was a problem on set, he'd say, I'm just going to go and lie down, wake me up when it's all been sorted out. He was just his film company was called Sandcastle.
Yeah.
And he said, I called it Sandcastle because making a movie is like building a sandcastle on the beach, and then you sit back in a deck chair and you have a beer and you watch the tide take it away. And he had that sort of childish spirit in him, inquisitive and kind of irreverent, and he was just very anti-establishment.
Yeah.
In everything he did, I guess.
That's so wonderful. I mean, what was it like? I mean, and I this is sort of general too. What is it like stepping into a milieu like that, where it is mannered and it is sort of this period piece, but it's also this winking sort of take on it all? I mean, what do you like about sort of doing period pieces, doing something like that?
Well, I don't, for me, I don't know any other way except to do it for real.
Yeah.
So I don't really know. To me, it doesn't have, obviously there's a style and everything to it, but to me it's feels very real and felt very real when we were doing it. So obviously you have to study how people behaved at the time, I guess. But yeah, I don't think of it as doing a style.
Okay. That's fascinating. I do have to ask, because you were working with Michael Gambon, and obviously your character is having an affair with his, and then years later he was in the Little Women adaptation you did. Yes. What is it like when you sort of reunite with someone all those years later?
It was lovely, actually. And he was, I think he felt a little bit adrift in Little Women. He sort of came and, we were in Dublin, and he felt he was just feeling a bit, and he was kind of clinging to me like an old, just because we'd done stuff together before. But he's remarkable, actually. Yeah. He's got he's like a whole bag of amazing tricks, and so naughty, so naughty. There was one of the young lads who was in Angela's Ashes went on to be in a play in the West End with Michael Gambon, and I went to see it, and it was the night that the signer was in, and there was a scene it was sort of Greeks and Romans in a sauna kind of scene, and I was thinking, wow, this is really, the language in this play is really filthy, but this is the West End, this is like, it's a bit risque. And I went backstage afterwards. He said, Emily, he was virtually crying. I don't know what to do. He's just trying to make me laugh all the time. And tonight, because the signer was in, he was just filling the whole thing with all this incredibly foul language just to see what the signer would do.
Oh my God.
He was so naughty.
That's so funny. That's such an incredible story. Speaking of other sort of fascinating and strange situations and incredible directors, Charlie Kaufman and Synecdoche. Obviously, you're playing a character that exists in the movie. Like your other sort of components played by Samantha Morton. What is that? What was that experience like for you?
It was, the whole thing was quite chaotic, in a great way. I mean, it really was, it was great. I had most of my scenes with Phil Hoffman, who I had known for a while because we'd worked together a couple of times before that. And, obviously he was great friends with Paul, and he was having a really, really, really tough time because he had all that prosthetics and, he had to age 100 years every other day kind of thing. So it was very, very intense, but it just had such a great feeling of all these actors turning up going, do you know what's going on? I don't know. No, I don't. But this is kind of interesting, isn't it? Felt like a really kind of, like he'd been given liberty to be creative in a really weird way. And that just doesn't happen in film, It's.
What was it like occupying that set? That scenario? I
remember reading a review of it, or reading an article about nudity on film, and saying, no, there's this person, and then there's Emily Watson, who is stark bollock naked for a full 5 minutes, which I was. So that was sort of quite a overpowering experience, or my memory of making the movie is. But actually, I just went, you know what, I've worked in Scandinavia. I don't care. I'm just going to take my clothes off, I'm going to rehearse naked, and I'm just going to wander around, and I don't care. It's all very different now.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was wondering if I wanted to ask you about your approach to nudity on, starting with Breaking the Waves and through. I mean, what do you think about doing it, about sort of, an experience of doing something like Synecdoche, or?
I've never been comfortable with it.
Yeah.
I've always told myself that I don't want to do something that's gratuitous.
Yeah.
If I'd go back and say to my younger self, you maybe don't need to do that, or you don't need, there probably. But it was just how it was,
Right.
It was expected. And, I mean, in a way, I quite celebrate all of that stuff. Because I've gone on to play characters, women in their 50s who are very sexual, and which is like, yes. It's a good thing, but. It's complex subject.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was something that I wanted to ask, bouncing off of not exactly that, but talking about God's creatures or Breaking the Waves or The Proposition, movies that have very sort of naughty takes on sexual violence. And I was just wondering how you prepare yourself for that going in, what you think about sort of tackling that on screen.
I think... interesting, those three films, God's Creature, I would say I have like a handful of pieces of work that I've done in my life which have felt like sacred ground, because of the nature of the subject matter and just the experience of making them, and those three are very much there. God's Creatures is a film about a sexual assault that you don't see an iota of it. Yeah. Which I think is a brilliantly realised thing. Yeah. There's beautiful women sitting over there who directed it. Yes. but it's, I've been involved in scenes of sexual violence a few times, and I guess I've always felt that you have to make it real and make it count.
Yeah.
And it not be easy, not be, make it count for what it is.
Yeah. We talked about Breaking the Waves, we talked about God's Creatures. You mentioned The Proposition as another film that you consider sort of sacred ground. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and why.
They did a re-release print of it at BFI recently when we had a screening, and it really holds up. And oh my God, it was ahead of its time in terms of the whole thing about race, and I mean the ugliness of, basically the ugliness of the British Empire, and what took place at that time. But it's a great movie, and I was like it was an incredibly violent film, and then in the middle of it is this little sort of Chekhovian duet. And Ray is not if you had to choose a scene partner for a Chekhovian duet, it would not be Ray Winston. And it was actually really wonderful.
Can you tell me a little bit about, sort of are there any other roles that you consider, sacred for you, the way you put it so beautifully?
I think it's a lot of the time that stuff doesn't necessarily translate into the finished product, but it's about the people you meet and the experiences you have. I had an incredible time shooting Richard E. Grant's film Wawa in Iswazi, which was then Swaziland, just because the extremity of his childhood experience up there on screen, and with Gabriel Byrne, Miranda Richardson, all these incredible actors. And we were all out there, sort of, it was like there was no small talk.
Right.
Every day was like that, being in a very, very difficult location and a very far-flung place where every day feels like survival. And it was an incredible experience.
That's incredible. What do you look for? We talked a little bit about the beginning, but, having done everything you've done, what are you sort of itching to do now, more recently? What are the sort of role? I know you have teenagers at home, but what are you sort of passionate about, sort of putting on screen?
Well, something will come along and surprise you. You'll read. Yeah. Chernobyl. That was a completely out of the blue. Just read that script and went, oh my God. And turned it down flat because of the teenagers, first of all.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was like 5 months in somewhere a long way away. And I said no, but then we figured it out. But that was an astonishing script. And just felt like a privilege to be part of something that was telling a story that really needed to be told. And it felt so potently about what was happening now, in terms of how a regime can, how if you don't tell the truth, if you're lying about everything, how we came close to destruction of humanity.
Were you surprised when Chernobyl sort of became as popular as it was?
Yes, it's quite a kind of niche subject, I think, isn't it? It's very austere and it's dark, but it really, really resonated with people.
Yeah. What do you like about sort of, when you pick a TV project, is there a different sort of thought behind it as between picking a film project? What do you like about, in TV projects when you pick them?
In a way, it's not different. Yeah. It's the same thing. It's about the people and the director and the script. And although you have to see yourself, how much time am I going to be spending playing this character or it's those kind of things. it's equally a rich world in terms of being creative, I think, in a different way, have time to develop something over time.
Yeah. Are there any sort of actors or directors that you're itching to work with again after, so many years?
Those two. I love working again with people that I've worked with over time. Like I've worked twice with Stellan Skarsgård.
Yes.
And that was such a great experience because we were able to sit down after 20 years and go back over the territory and really talk about it in a way, because at the time I was so and
what was it like when you sort of went back with him and discussed what you had been through?
It was great, actually. It was great because I'd sort of felt so in a way in a state of shock at the time that I was a bit frozen by it all. So it was interesting. Yeah.
Are there sort of going back, this is a pretty basic question, but I wanted to ask about process. You mentioned sort of the voice. What is your sort of process for getting into a role? Like, where do you start once you get the thing? What is the research process like? Because, you worked on The Boxer with Daniel Day-Lewis, who's so famous for his intense process. Yeah. What is yours?
It's kind of slightly different every time. It depends on the project and the people, but I have to, I guess, find a place where I feel authentic.
Yeah.
If I begin to feel authentic as the character, it's because I've found out all the shit that I need to know about their life, their world, their family, their relationships, their education, there's all those sort of obvious things on the outside, but then people have secrets and desires and things that aren't obvious. I don't know, and then there'll be just one thing that one day you'll go, okay, that clicks. Something away in maybe.
Well, this is so great. I think we're going to go to some audience questions now. What is the most self-doubt / insecurity you felt as an actor, and how did you move through it?
That's a good one. Oh, it's a lot. There's a lot of it, I think. I sometimes get to a point where if something doesn't feel it's going right, and I just start to feel like, if something's doesn't feel right, or I'm not getting it, I'm not hitting it, it's the worst feeling. You feel so fake, and you feel like, this is the day that I get rumbled. And it's a horrible feeling. And I have actually some advice that I was given by Stellan, was don't aim for anything, let go, just let go. And that's actually, in that situation, is really good, because the more panicky you get about, oh my God, I'm not reaching this point, the worse it is. And actually just to be able to tell yourself, let go.
Yeah.
You can't control this moment, just see what happens, help sometimes.
Yeah. Well, these ones I think we covered a little bit, because one was how do you approach a role, which we discussed. Another one was what it was like to work with Stellan Skarsgård, which we did discuss. Do you have anything else to add to either of those?
Gorgeous.
This is interesting. What was the earliest that you've been brought onto a project, and by who?
It's a very different feel when you get brought on early on.
Yeah.
Because you can help. I guess, if you are the lead in something, you really can set a tone.
Yeah.
And you can set a sort of a standard and a level of behavior and the way people treat each other and all those kind of things, which are, can be very conducive to good work.
Yeah.
And if you're, not that, if you're coming on later, then you're very much sometimes you're very lucky that everybody's like that anyway, and sometimes you're not. What's the thing I've come on to the earliest? I always think, though, those things never really work out. This are the things that you really love, that you develop them for years and years and years, and they never happen.
Yeah.
Oh God, my lack of sleep, my mind is going.
It's okay. Emily flew in today.
Sorry,
so.
whoever's question that was.
What is the best way to make industry connections?
I tend to just run away and hide, so I'm not very good. I think it's so hard, that one, because so many actors are actually not extroverts. They're introverts. They're people looking for somewhere to hide or to escape. And I think I was definitely that.
Yeah.
And my husband, when he was an actor, when I met him, he was that as well. And for a lot of people, that whole climbing a greasy pole thing is toe-curlingly horrible. Yeah. And yet you somehow have to do it. I had a woman at drama school who gave me some really good advice. She said, it's the business side of that stuff. You just have to do it with dignity. And that's the best I can say.
And the last two questions from our audience, there's two on these, but I do think they're really, you mentioned earlier breaking down after playing Bess, and one was, how do you recover? How do you approach this heavier material, and how do you recover from playing someone like Bess in Breaking the Waves?
I've got better at it over the years. I've got better at realizing that, and this is the sort of shit that sounds really stupid when you're talking to civilians, but I guess that the neural pathways that you travel down when you're playing a role, your body doesn't know the difference from ones that you travel down for things that happen in your actual life. So you have to, and they leave an imprint. And so you have to just do the work to just let it go. Whatever that, in it's, it can be just physical, going for long walks, but just actively let that imprint go, because you don't need it.
And this is a classic. What is something you would advise your younger self as an actor? It's
going to be okay. Don't worry. Yeah.
Well, it certainly is. Emily, thank you so much for being here. Everyone, thank you for being here. This is so wonderful.